Hi, everybody. It's great. It's great to be here, and I want to thank first of all Lottie and Jane and Susanna for organizing this great salon. So I will be presenting together with Khairani Barokka. We are both researchers in residence at the UAL Decolonising the Arts Institute, which is in its pilot year this year and will be formally launched in the autumn. And together with artist Mohamed Namazi and curator Ana Sol Gonzalez Rueda, we are the first cohort of researchers in residence at the institute. The residence is actually titled Decolonising the Archives, and each of us is working with a different collection and archive at the UAL. And I hand it over to Okka now.
So thanks, Elisa, and thank you again to everyone for being here and for organizing this. So Elisa and I will present our individual projects, which are still very much in progress. We're doing this over the course of the whole year, outlining the challenges inherent in working with established and entrenched institutions and formations, to offer two different examples of what shapes the work of decolonization can take, and what it can do to destabilize existent archives. So I'm also a research fellow at UAL's Decolonising Arts Institute, and as a disabled and chronically ill artist, my research by practice over the past 9 years or so has been focused on cripping, or the act of making apparent disabled stories in archives, much like queering makes apparent queer stories in archives. So my project is tentatively called We Were Always Here, Deaf and or Disabled Histories in Archives. Okay, so as Elisa mentioned, each of us researchers deals with a different archive or collection at UAL, and I specifically chose the African Caribbean, Asian, and African Art in Britain archive, which is part of special collections at the UAL Chelsea campus. That is the full title. And what it is those gray boxes at the very top there, they contain all the materials that I'm working with. And it goes back from the 70s to the early 2000s. So my objects of inquiry are basically founded on these two questions. One, how do we indicate the marks of ableism and the persistence of deaf and disabled cultures in existing archives? And two, how do we use cripping, in other words, the indication of deaf and disabled people's existence and able normative archives or texts as part of decolonizing efforts? So We Were Always Here builds on my research into how ableism both masks the historical presence of deaf and disabled people of Asian, Afro-Caribbean, and African descent in art archives and excludes us from them. Working with the Afro-Caribbean, Asian, and African Art in Britain archive, I'm just trying to say that as smoothly as I can each time. I'll demonstrate how deaf and or disabled people of these backgrounds, especially women and non-binary people, have always already been part of these materials, and shows how the archives can be made more accessible. The work also points to the urgent political implications of including and problematizing the handling of archives chronicling complaints by deaf and or disabled UAL faculty, staff, and students of Asian, Afro-Caribbean, and African descent. So I'm working obviously a lot with Sarah Ahmed's notion of complaint as feminist killjoys, and looking a lot at, with the momentum of quote unquote visibility of Black Lives Matter, which has been going on for about a decade now, the rise of complaints in different areas is made as more acknowledged, not more visible, but more acknowledged by people at UAL. For instance, there is an Instagram account called @UALTruth, which is an anonymous account and chronicles all the instances of racism and sexism and ableism that people are willing to share anonymously. I encourage you to seek that out. The final work incorporates creative nonfiction and original artwork in a paper, as well as a performance lecture. So I work with the words of disability, illness, health, cure, impairment, and pain, problematizing all of these, particularly as someone who has quote unquote an invisible disability, which isn't actually invisible because you can see how often I lie down and you can see how I walk in a different way. So invisible to whom? So I no longer use the term invisible disability. And I look at how those terms intersect with the concepts of race, ethnicity, and nationality. So on the right is just an example from the archives that I was looking at when there was an exhibition of the private collection of the African National Congress, actually, including that sign that says whites only, because I work with the concept of ableism as racism as ableism, because both systems are part of this question, what is a quote unquote good body? So what models of race and disability have, just a moment, I'm trying to, okay, apologies, just, I think it'll be easier if I use my, if I use my mouse in this way. Okay. So what models of race and disability have been used in previous art exhibitions, whether in the works themselves, the promotion of them, the reviewing of them, the archiving of them? What forms of ableism are here? What forms of anti-ableism as anti-colonial work are here? Because, for instance, as an Indonesian woman, I know that with the advent of colonialism, there was Dutch missionary medicine and the hospitals that came along with that actually erased this concept of disability as being spiritual and closer to the gods. So my ethnicities in Indonesia are Javanese and Minang, and in Javanese, we actually have disabled gods. But the ableism that colonialism brought has been so entrenched that even though I knew, like I see the images of disabled gods, and it took me literally until graduate school to be like, oh my God, you know, pun not intended, you know, this is part of my lineage and is part of why me and my kin should not feel so ashamed of ourselves. And also, working with different configurations of what constitutes a good body also intersects, obviously, with concepts of gender, because in Indonesia, we have so many genders that are not found in Western terminology that non-binary doesn't even cover. So looking at what is a good body, you know, what constitutes a disability or an impairment, and these other words are very socially determined and extremely culturally specific. So I want people to have that in mind when thinking about archives. All right, so the ways in which I work with the archives and sort of source out the appearance of disability is, first of all, the assumption that someone is non-disabled until proven disabled needs to be disproved, right? So I'm working with the assumption that literally any artist in the archive, any subject of their art in the archive could have been or could be deaf and or disabled. First of all, disclosure is a big thing, right? Everybody has the right to disclose or not disclose whether or not you have anxiety or depression or endometriosis or any of these things that could be classified as a disability. And it is completely up to each artist to disclose that. But I want to look at how, specifically in the context, especially of how disability arts, quote unquote, is often marginalized, how archives already always deal with disability when you talk about the body, whether it's AIDS, whether it's race, whether it's colorism, whether it's the concept of peace and imperialism. So a few theorists that I draw into my own work, Achille Mbembe's Necropolitics, Jasbir Puer's 2017 book, The Right to Maim, which is a really important book as it relates to my own work, because The Right to Maim basically says that, you know, in neoliberal societies like the US, the UK, even Indonesia, disability rights is tied into this neoliberal concepts of empowerment, right? So the state supposedly enables disabled people more and more as time goes on, supposedly. At the same time, the state also enables the maiming of bodies in places like Palestine. In Indonesia, that would be in Papua, which we still colonize, right? So you're disabling bodies, you're creating disabled bodies, and also I want people to not think of disability in such binary terms as negative or positive, because these are whole people, right, and whole lived experiences. And people become disabled, but that doesn't necessarily, I want to really avoid the charity model. I want to avoid pity. I like saying fuck pity a lot. So to just keep that in mind. And I also want to think about empire as enacting violence in the archives. So I use Sarah Ahmed's work on the sociality of emotions, how we're taught to feel precisely about certain archives, right? Whether we're taught to feel pity about disabled artists. I went to a talk recently at UAL where Yinka Shonibari's work was being discussed. And he obviously had a lot of tragedy in his life because of disability and everything. And I was like, well, we really need to look at what the artist is or is not willing to say about that and what they have said, and to really not speak about people's whole full lives in such binary terms. Marisa Fuentes is also an influence on reading archives against the biased grain, and Laura Stoller, who has worked actually a lot on Indonesia, race, gender, sexuality, and Laura Stoller is also an archivist who really takes issue with Foucault's lack of consideration for empire in his work. So I work a lot with Laura Stoller's work on this concept of imperial duress, which is that basically colonialism never left, it's still here, but crypt. So that's always my angle. So just to close, I would like people to think more critically as faculty, staff, students at UAL, and also the general public, about how these words, just as examples, just as a few examples, are problematized and curated and exhibited and presented and marketed and used in curricula, right, as all of which pertains to the arts and archives. AIDS, access, quote unquote, the mentally handicapped, violence, captions, quote unquote, outsider art, empire, survival, violence, stealth. Thank you. So, and okay, addenda. If you want, you can spend a little bit more time at some point thinking about how ableist models, if you don't already, of disability and wellness, etc., show up in all of our own lives as people working with archives, whether or not we identify as disabled, deaf, and are chronically ill. Thank you, and I'll hand it over to Elisa.
Okay, so like Okka, I'm working on a particular archive at the UAL, and the archive I'm working on is the Thorold Dickinson archive, which is housed at the Archive and Special Collections Center, again, a very long name, at the LCC part of the UAL. And this is just, like the homepage of the archive online. And Thorold Dickinson was a British film director. I'm not interested in his own work, but what I'm interested in actually is something really minor, a micro event in his life. Because in December 1937, at the London Film Society, Dickinson presented a program that dovetailed alternate reels from Italian and Soviet propaganda, depicting the fascist invasion of Ethiopia that was initiated in October, at least officially in October 1935, so 2 years earlier. Titled A Record of War, the screening played the glorification of militarism in The Path of Heroes, which was a film commissioned by the fascist regime in 1936, against the documentation of atrocities, among which the Italians' use of poison gas in the Russian film Abyssinia, which was also made in 1936. So the pomp of the former is basically undercut by the horror of the latter film. And this was like a pioneering attempt at deconstructing the official falsehoods of propaganda, turning propaganda of the Mussolini regime against itself. Now, the traces of this micro event in the archive are very paltry, but from the very beginning, I wasn't that interested in what is in the archive, but actually what is absent from the archive, what is not there. And specifically, the absence of the voices of anti-colonial intellectuals, which at the time were living in London. So it's important to know that the Italian invasion of Ethiopia was actually an incredibly important event in this period that powerfully captured and inflamed the imagination of Black people around the world. In the 30s, Ethiopia and Liberia were the only two Black sovereign nations that were recognized by the League of Nations. And so the invasion of Ethiopia was perceived as an attack on the very principle of Black sovereignty at a time when the great majority of the peoples of the African diaspora were living under colonial domination. Now, at this historical juncture, London was an incubator for radical Black internationalist discourse. And after the invasion of Abyssinia, of Ethiopia, there are many Black campaigners which started to organize, and they held anti-war rallies, which were attended by many people. And the images that you see here are actually taken from an anti-war rally in Trafalgar Square in 1955, which was organized by the International African Friends of Abyssinia, an organization which was spearheaded by figures like Cilla James, George Padmore, but also Emi Ashwood-Garvey. And Emi Ashwood-Garvey, just as an aside, was a very interesting figure, because she was really a dynamic force in the London scene. But she's ill represented in the archive. So if you like, there's an erasure in the erasure happening there. Now, one of the things that I started noting, like working on these things, and one of my kind of points of departure was the fact that while closely connected, these two stories, so Dickinson's screening and like Hovis organization by Pan-African intellectuals at the time, these two stories do not meet in the archives. So they are kept apart, they are separated and segregated. And Black agency in the archives often, and surely in the Thorold Dickinson's archive, features only as an elision, as an absence. So these archival conditions determine the kind of stories that we tell, and also the kind of narratives that we reproduce. So the work that I'm doing tries to break such archival conditions. And one of the things that I've tried to do initially was actually to reconnect these stories by reconstructing what was the larger milieu in which Dickinson's screening took place. And I started to looking at various figures that were actually involved in the Ethiopian cause at the time. One of them was like the feminist and suffragette Sylvia Pankhurst. But I've also started to speculate on the possible potential encounters of Thorold Dickinson with Cilla James, and I found this article which actually says that maybe speculates on the possibility that Cilla James was in the audience at the London Film Society when A Record of War was screened. This is really a minutiae in the archive, and probably is not very important. It's not important if they met or not, if he was there at the screening or not. But one of the things that I'm interested in doing in this research is actually trying to recenter Black agency in the archive. And I do so by tapping into the radical critiques of colonialism that one can find in the writings of intellectuals like James and Padmore. So while firstly condemning fascism at the time, James and Padmore did not make any excuse or any concession to the violent history of British colonialism and imperialism, but rather they endeavored to underline the connections between these two different forms, like these two forms of European colonialism. And this stands in contrast, in stark contrast with someone like Thorold Dickinson, who is instead much more apologetic when it comes to the British Empire. So what I'm doing now in my research, which is still very much in progress, is trying to adopt the rhetorical device of dovetailing, so the juxtaposition of images taken from different reels, which Dickinson had used in A Record of War in his screening, and I apply it to Dickinson's own archive. And in dovetailing images, but also film extracts, documents, and textual material, which I take from Dickinson's archive, but also from other archives, I try to expand what is not in the archive, and also to deconstruct and interrogate what is there. And so I want to conclude just with an example of this dovetailing method, where I put together, like on the left, you see an image that is actually taken from The Path of Heroes, so the Fascist film that was used by Thorold Dickinson in his screening. And on the other side is instead an image taken from Dickinson's own film, Men of Two Worlds, which was commissioned by the British Colonial Office and was released in 1946, so just after the Second World War. And in both cases, you see the use of cinema by an occupying force in an African village to instruct and indoctrinate indoctrinate the local populations. And there is this kind of uneasy continuity that is revealed in rhetoric, dispositions, and assumptions of Westerners towards their colonial subjects. And yeah, I'm ending it there. Thank you.